Hi,
Thank
welcome
you.
to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this very important talk. Um, with me are also my colleagues, Tyler Beebe, who will be your host shortly, Naomi Marrow, Peter Russell. Um, and so just to sort of put a little bit of preface in this, um, I think for all of us in America and the United States, this is probably the most turbulent and challenging of times in our history, in our very young history. We live in multipolar world, um, and we feel democracy, our normalcy, what we understand our life to be, and the rule of law are all under threat. 2 weeks ago, we heard from Evelyn Farkas from the McCain Institute, and she was speaking about um, the aggression from Russia to Europe. One of the areas that we watch very carefully. Today, we have Ken Jackson from the American Enterprise Institute, who will be speaking about the war in Gaza and the threat of its expansion to the Middle East and beyond. And in 4 weeks, we will then also turn our attention to the superpower of China and its aspirations on its neighbors, as well as the United States. All our programs are hosted by the Chappaqua Library. We're very thankful. They're presented live, as you know, and they're also recorded for on-demand viewing and can be accessed from the Chappaqua website. So we're going to follow our usual format. Tyler is our host. He will be introducing our speaker, Ken Pollack, who we have back with us by popular demand. Ken will speak for 25-30 minutes. Tyler will then open a Q&A, so please look for the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, ask your questions. The first questions will be asked by our group just to get the conversation going, and then I'll read your questions to Ken for him to answer. We will end the program around 11:15, but we'll, maybe a very lively conversation, so we'll see how it goes and how Ken's time works. So with that, let me turn this over to Tyler Beebe.
Okay, thanks, June. And welcome everyone. Glad you could join us this morning. Well, as we all know only too well, the tragic events of October 7th have greatly complicated an already tenuous situation in almost every corner of the Middle East. So we're most fortunate today to welcome back Ken Pollack, who is eminently qualified to put recent events in perspective. He will hopefully assess the chances that the region can stabilize over time, can avert more widespread conflict, and possibly maintain constructive ties. Of course, that's with the exception of places like Iran, with the US. Now, many of you are familiar with Ken because you've seen him in prior sessions. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, where he focuses on all aspects of the Middle East. For those of us with decent intermediate term memories, you'll recall that he addressed the Chappaqua group way back in 2014 and has joined us several times since then, which we very much appreciate. Ken began his career as a military analyst with the CIA, focusing on Iran and Iraq. He then served twice on the National Security Council in Washington, the second time as Director of Persian Gulf Affairs. He joined the Council on Foreign Relations in 2001 as a senior fellow. Then he played the same role at the Brookings Institution, where he headed up the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy. As his career evolved, he somehow found the time to author 10 books, and he just told us he's working on his 11th on the Middle East. Now, very recently, about 10 days ago, Ken obviously recently, co-authored a think piece for the Wall Street Journal titled, "Washington Can't Let the Houthis Target Yemen." Take Yemen, I'm sorry. Hopefully we can focus briefly sometime during the discussion on that article. So Ken, plenty to talk about, obviously. Thanks so much for joining us again. and I will turn the baton over to you.
Thank you very much, Tyler. And good morning, Chappaqua. It is wonderful to be with you again. I wish that the circumstances were better, but then again, you probably wouldn't invite me if they were. What I thought I'd do with my opening remarks is try to kind of lay out the state of affairs in a number of the most important conflict areas within the Middle East. And I thought I would start with the kind of the center of it all, the one that is getting the most attention and that began so many of the other problems in the region, although it's now in some ways just one of many conflicts brewing, and that is the conflict between Israel and Hamas being fought out in Gaza. Where things stand at this moment on February 26, 2024, is that Israel has mostly cleared the northern Gaza Strip. And as Tyler explained, the Israelis are now very much focused on the southern half of the Gaza Strip. While there is a lot of international pressure on Israel to cease its operations, declare a ceasefire, and not go into the south, that seems very unlikely. Prime Minister Netanyahu and, quite frankly, the entire Israeli leadership is quite resolved to push on, clear out the entire Gaza Strip, destroy Hamas to the best of its ability. Obviously, that is going to protract the fighting. We've already seen months of fighting. It has taken months for the Israelis to even do as much as they've been able to do in the northern Gaza Strip. And as you've doubtless seen from any number of newspaper articles, the fighting even in the north is not fully over yet. This was always going to be a problem. It's one thing to go in and clear out a densely populated urban area like the Gaza Strip. It's something else entirely to keep it clear, to root out the last elements of opposition there. You're always going to have infiltrators sneaking back in. This is a major issue that the Israelis are likely to face for as long as they're in Gaza. And that, of course, is an open-ended question, which I'll come to in just a moment. But right now, it seems like very clear they're going to move into the southern part of the Gaza Strip. From my perspective, that was always in the cards. Israeli military plans from the very beginning made it clear that they were going to do so. You can't destroy Hamas, whatever that may mean, simply by clearing the northern Gaza Strip. Hamas are not idiots, as they demonstrated, unfortunately, well on October 7th. If the Israelis had said, we're just going to clear the northern Gaza Strip, obviously, Hamas would flow down into the south. The Israelis understood that. Initially, as I understood it, the Israeli plan, the Israeli hope, was that they could clear the northern Gaza Strip and then make it possible for the Palestinian civilian population to move north, right? So push them all south, have the Israeli military clear the north, then when they're ready to do the south, allow the Palestinian civilian population to come back north. That's all proven much more problematic than the Israelis initially envisioned. In war, plans, as the great Helmut von Moltke once pointed out, plans never survive contact with the enemy's main force. And in this case, that is also proven true. But that has not meant that the Israelis are going to short circuit their operation. They're going to move south, and one of the big questions will, of course, be what happens to the Palestinian civilian population. So far, both sides, all sides, seem to agree that perhaps as many as somewhere around 30,000 have died or 30,000 Palestinians have died in the fighting in Gaza. About a third are likely to have been Hamas fighters, the other 2/3 civilians. How you feel about that obviously depends very much on whose side you started out on. There's no question that there is a great deal of international pressure that sees the Israeli campaign as killing too many civilians. But I think, as many of you know, from the Israeli perspective, they feel like they have no alternative but to do this because they feel it is the only way to secure themselves against further attacks, against further October 7th, which we should always remember, Hamas has loudly vowed to repeat as frequently as they can. I think that the biggest question moving forward, and it is something that the United States, other countries have started to push the Israelis to focus on, is this question of what happens in Gaza after. right? After the Israeli military operation ends, whenever that is, and that will probably not be for weeks, if not months, but when it ends, what happens then? And what's been interesting to me is that you've seen a whole variety of different actors suggesting how to handle Gaza afterwards, including increasingly the Israelis. And again, I think that's all to the good. We do need to recognize that wars cannot be conducted simply for the sake of killing. Right? Warfare is about creating a better end state, a better peace when they're finally over. And so the question of what happens to Gaza after the Israeli military operations are done is not, it can't be an afterthought. It has to be critical. It has to be baked into what is going on right now. And it has to be an incentive to both Israel and other countries to start planning for that day after. And as I said, you've had a number of different actors now starting to put forward different ideas. What's been striking to me, but unfortunately not surprising, is that everyone believes that everyone else's plans for the day after in Gaza are absolutely inconceivable, absolutely unimaginable and impossible. We've seen Arab plans, we've seen American plans, we've seen Israeli plans, we've seen UN plans, European plans. Everybody is coming in with different plans. And again, everyone else thinks that everyone's plans are absolutely inconceivable and unimaginable. Now, first point to make is that at the end of the day, it is Israel that is likely to be in control of Gaza. And therefore, what Israel decides is going to be the most important marker of all. The Israelis will have control. They will be the ones who will get to decide what happens in Gaza. And it's important to recognize that there is literally only one country on the planet that could force Israel to change its mind and do something else, and that is the United States. And while the United States seems likely to push and prod and cajole and hopefully influence Israeli thinking, it seems highly unlikely that the United States would go to war with Israel to prevent it from controlling Gaza or doing whatever it wants to in Gaza, and seems likely to be willing to alleviate any other additional international pressure. And again, given Israel's state of mind, given where the Israeli populace is in terms of its collective psyche, and where Israel's leadership is, it seems very unlikely that even heavy international pressure, even international sanctions, if it were somehow possible to get them, would be unlikely to convince the Israelis. So point number one is, at the end of the day, it's going to be Israel that decides what happens in Gaza. And right now, the plans that Israel are putting forward, again, everyone else believes are inconceivable, that they're not going to work. They won't work for the Palestinians. They won't work for the Israelis. But the Israeli government, especially if Prime Minister Netanyahu is able to remain in power, they may become the plans that are operative. And they call for clearing out a strip of territory adjacent to Israel. They call for the Israeli military remaining the primary security force in Israel, along with some kind of new Palestinian leadership that would handle the political and economic aspects of governance in Gaza. And again, as I've said, everyone else except Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to think that that is impossible and inconceivable. And there are lots of good reasons why those people are criticizing it in those ways. It does have a lot of downsides to it. But again, we should start by recognizing that the Israelis will have the final say. That may be what we end up seeing there. Beyond that, though, you have a whole variety of other plans. Many of you have probably read in the newspaper about the idea that the Biden administration has been floating, which is that you would have a peacekeeping force, a multinational peacekeeping force that would not include American troops, but would be led by an American general, that there would be a major UN presence to help with political and economic reconstruction, but that ultimately you would bring in some version of the current Palestinian Authority, which rules in the West Bank, and you'd bring that into Gaza to ultimately become the nucleus or the embryo of a new Palestinian government there. And again, everybody is pointing out that this is highly problematic. And I will simply say that I think that what's most problematic about it is that I can't imagine that the Israelis would accept any kind of a peacekeeping force in Gaza other than the Israeli military if that peacekeeping force did not include large numbers of American soldiers. Israel's experience with the United Nations and UN peacekeeping forces, multinational peacekeeping forces, are that they simply don't trust these people, right? For good reason. Most of these forces have no ability to enforce anything. You can look at UNIFIL, the United Nations missions in Lebanon, which Israel has repeatedly pointed out does nothing to inhibit Hezbollah's control over Lebanon or its attacks into Israel. And so the Israelis are just not going to trust anyone other than the United States, which it knows has Israel's back and also has soldiers both with the capability and the will to actually make peace, not just keep it. And so this idea that you could have a US general but not US troops, it's highly, highly unlikely. And so ultimately, it's just my way of saying that I think that the plan that the Biden administration has laid out is an interesting one, worth considering. But I do agree that in its current form, it's unworkable. And I agree that pretty much all of these plans have very, very significant problems. The question mark to me is whether over the course of time, we will see all of these groups start to negotiate, compromises reached, and a better, actually more workable plan come to fruition, even though it will be one that everyone has to compromise on. If that's the case, then we may have a good alternative to what the Israeli leadership seems to want to do right now. If not, that seems likely to be the default mode. Obviously glad to talk more about Israel and the Palestinians later on in the Q&A, but I wanted to start there, and I think that that gives us a pretty good sense of where things are right now and where they may be headed over the longer term. Let me switch gears and talk a little bit now about Yemen and the Houthis, another very big issue, one that I can't imagine any American was really thinking that he or she would be likely to have to contemplate when the attack on October 7th took place. But unfortunately, welcome to the Middle East. This is the kind of thing that happens there. Uh, Glad to give a more fulsome lecture on the Houthis if you'd all like, but just very, very quickly in a nutshell. The Houthis represent a fundamentalist strand within the Zaidi community of Yemen. I know I've already exceeded what most of you know about Yemen coming into this conversation, but again, I'm going to give you a little bit here. The Zaidis are the Shia community of Yemen. They represent about somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population, depending on who you want to believe. They are an old, established part of Yemeni society, very well accepted in Yemeni society. In fact, before 1962, the monarch of Yemen, the Imam of Yemen, was a Zaidi Shia, even though most of the country are Sunni Muslims. In 2004, however, this fundamentalist sect, the Houthis, this fundamentalist element, they're a family, clan, tribe, hard to really explain, but within the Zaidi community, they more or less gained control over the Zaidis, even though they've got different religious beliefs from most of the Zaidis. And they began launching repeated military operations against the then dictatorial government of Yemen. In 2014, the government of Yemen collapsed. The Houthis allied with the former dictator and started a civil war, became one of the main components of a civil war, which quickly took over most of northern Yemen. The capital, Sana'a, and much of the northern part of the country, threatened the south of Yemen. At that point in time, other groups rallied, coalesced, formed a coalition against the Houthis, a coalition which included the internationally recognized government of Yemen, which at that time was backed by the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis. This is when the Saudis and the Emiratis intervened in 2015, and this civil war has been going on ever since. Now, what's important to understand from that little bit of history that I just gave you is that the Houthis are a minority within a minority within a minority. And what's more, they're even more of a minority because very, very early on in that conflict, they started getting support from Iran. Right? The Iranians go looking for violent extremists looking to overturn the status quo wherever they can find them. And if those groups are Shia, so much the better. Now, always worth remembering, the Iranians tend to be much more ecumenical than we give them credit for. They will support any violent extremist group, regardless of whether they're Sunni or Shia. We see the Middle East in these binary Iran, Shia, Saudi, Sunni terms that actually don't really apply. Remember, the Iranians are also Hamas's main backer, and Hamas is a militant Sunni Islamist group. So again, Iran's willing to back any, but in the case of Yemen, there was an obvious affinity with the Houthis, and they saw it as a wonderful opportunity to make trouble for the Saudis, for the Emiratis, for us to a certain extent as well. Because the Houthis were a minority within a minority within a minority within a further minority, because they were allied with Iran, they were deeply unpopular in the Arab and Islamic world. And after October 7th, they clearly saw an opportunity. Now, it's worth noting, the Houthis hate Israel, and they are deeply anti-Semitic. Many of you are probably aware of this kind of Houthi slogan that they use. God is great, death to America, death to Israel, a curse on the Jews, victory to Islam. They really believe that. A number of years ago, actually not many, 2-3 years ago, I guess it was, I got to meet with a number of senior Houthi officials in one of these kind of, track 2 settings, and understand, I met with like in effect, their propaganda minister and their foreign minister. These are usually the kinds of people who are adept at dealing with outsiders, and therefore they tend to be a bit more polished. They tend to be a bit more restrained in how they describe their group's activities, right? Typically, you meet this kind of a person from some kind of an extremist group, and they'll tell you, we're misunderstood. That's all propaganda. We really don't believe that stuff. We're only killing in self-defense. All I can tell you is my colleagues and I were absolutely shocked by our meeting with these Houthi representatives. They did not budge 1 inch from that line. They were wildly anti-Semitic, wildly anti-Israel, wildly anti-American. And even as some of the people in my group, and it was a small group of other experts on the Middle East, all of us former US government officials, even as we said to them, things like, do you understand how what you're saying sounds to us? Do you understand how it makes us feel, what it makes us want to do to you? And their response was basically, we don't care, right? This is what we believe. This is what we're going to do, and we're going to do it to you. Right? It gives you, I think, some insight into who the Houthis are, certainly at this moment in time, and how they think about the world. So after Hamas launched its appalling terrorist attacks on Israel on October 7th, there's no question that the Houthis were engaged in this because they wanted to kill Israelis, wanted to kill Jews, but it also was extremely helpful to them in terms of suddenly allowing them to ingratiate themselves with the rest of the Arab world and the rest of the Muslim world. For the first time ever, by jumping on board the Palestinian bandwagon and starting to attack Israel and Israel's great ally, the United States, the Houthis could suddenly associate themselves with a very popular Arab cause, a very popular Muslim cause. Right? In addition, the way that the Houthis chose to do that, as you're all aware, is by starting to mount these attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, and in particular through this narrow maritime choke point, the Bab el-Mandeb, right, which is right off the coast of Yemen, through which 12% of the world's shipping passes. Now, this too was really important to the Houthis, really useful to them, because it demonstrated to the rest of the world how important the Houthis were. That they weren't just some, bunch of benighted fundamentalist Muslims hiding in caves in Yemen, killing other Yemenis for reasons that no one else in the world could understand. For the first time, they were now global players. They were fighting against the world's last superpower, one of the world superpowers now that China is rising, the United States. They were landing blows somehow for Israel, right? They were demonstrating that they were important and that the world had to take notice of them. Right? That's also really important for the Houthis. Remember that slogan, right? It starts with God is great and it ends with victory to Islam. And in the middle is stuff about the United States and Israel and Jews. There's nothing about Yemen in any of that slogan, right? Which demonstrates that ultimately the Houthis do want to play this outsized role. They want to be players on the global stage. And these attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, the last piece of it was that it allowed the Houthis to do so. Now, obviously, to a certain extent, Iran benefits from all of this. This is all great from Iran, right? Iran is trying to destroy the state of Israel. Iran is trying to drive the United States out of the Middle East. These Houthi attacks help with that. In addition, the more that Iran can demonstrate that its allies, groups like the Houthis, are important, can control global access to important shipping lanes, all of this stuff further redounds to Iran's benefit. But the point that I've been trying to make here, or the point I hope that you took away from my little history lesson and my points about why the Houthis are doing what they're doing, is that the Houthis themselves are getting a tremendous amount out of these attacks. It's not just about Iran. They're not doing these attacks for Iran. They're doing these attacks because it benefits them. And that's really important, because the way that the United States and the wider global community has chosen to respond to the Houthi attacks are really about just playing defense. And we're doing a lot, and I actually give the Biden administration a great deal of credit. These are not cruise missile pinpricks. The Biden administration is hitting dozens of targets, and they are hitting Houthi anti-ship assets before the Houthis can fire shots in many cases. That's a very aggressive campaign. Again, that's much bigger and more aggressive than anything, frankly, we saw from either the Trump or Obama administrations. That is the best way to defend shipping in the Red Sea. But as you're seeing, first, we're not getting everything. Houthi missiles are slipping through, and they undoubtedly will continue. And that just means that the shipping companies and the insurance companies just don't feel it's worth the risk of continuing to put ships through the Red Sea. And ultimately, what any military strategist will tell you is you just cannot win a war by doing nothing but playing defense. And aggressive as it is, as powerful as it has been, the Biden administration's campaign has been simply playing defense. They are shooting down Houthi missiles when they're fired, and they're trying to take out Houthi missiles before they can be fired. That's just playing defense. And it's unlikely to succeed because the Houthis have so much invested in this, because they are getting so much from this. And we should also recognize that the assets that the United States is using are really expensive, right? Cruise missiles go for over $2 million a pop. If God forbid any of our aircraft get shot down, right? You're talking about 40, 50, 60 million for an F-18, even more for some of the bigger planes out there. The missiles and the drones that the Houthis are using, they often go for tens of thousands, sometimes even just thousands or hundreds of dollars, right? They're very, very cheap, and they're even cheaper for the Houthis since the Iranians are the ones actually paying for this stuff, right? Over time, it seems unlikely that we're going to be able to sustain this. It seems unlikely that this is going to be enough. And that's why a variety of different people, including the US government, are trying to think about what's plan B. What do we do next? If simply playing defense doesn't prove to be enough, which seems likely given what the Houthis are getting from this campaign, what do we do next? People have been talking about the idea of going after the Iranians directly. And there's some things to think about there. And I want to come last to this question of Iraq and Syria and Iran. I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to that. But the simple point to make is to go back to my explanation of what the Houthis are getting at this, and understand that even if we do put a lot of pressure on Iran, even if we start striking targets that are very valuable to the Iranians, it's really not clear that the Iranians could turn off the Houthi attacks if they wanted to, because the Houthis are getting so much out of these attacks independently. Because these attacks are so valuable to the Houthis themselves, the Iranians may not have the ability to shut them down. Again, at the end of the day, Iran is the ally of the Houthis. They do not control it. And as I've suggested to you, the Houthis are absolutely out of control, right? They are like junkyard dogs. And I think that the Iranians like it because they can just kind of let them loose, but they've never tried to rein that dog in. And I think they'd have a lot of trouble if they did so, which is also why, again, the US government and others are talking about other ideas. One idea out there, I think probably the next step for the Biden administration is that they'll try to go after targets of higher value to the Houthis. The problem there is there just isn't a whole lot of higher value to the Houthis that the US can actually destroy. Yemen is a desperately poor country. The Houthis are desperately poor themselves. They don't control Yemen's oil producing regions. They're small, there aren't many, and they're not controlled by the Houthis. Their military is, beyond third world. The Yemeni civil war is mostly fought with, Kalashnikovs and mortars and RPGs. An old Soviet T-55 tank from the 1950s is kind of queen of the battlefield in the Yemeni civil war. So there just aren't a whole lot of assets that the US could go after. We may wind up trying to kill Houthi leaders, right? This is something that you've seen the United States and Israel and other countries do repeatedly over the last 20 years. Remember, that's how we did a tremendous amount of damage to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, right? It was killing their leaders using drone strikes. We may try to do that next against the Houthis. Again, not clear that that will work, not clear that who will be able to kill. And again, the Houthis are fundamentalist zealots, not clear that it will have the impact we desire, which is why kind of the last straw out there is for the United States to begin a clandestine campaign, not boots on the ground, but covert assistance to the government of Yemen, right? That coalition that has been opposing the Houthis all along, which, very famously, of course, the Saudis and the Emiratis were trying to back, and they kept trying to tell us, hey, you need to help us because you don't understand how dangerous the Houthis were. And the United States, under both the Obama and Trump administrations, said, no, we don't want to have any part of that. We don't care about Yemen. We don't think it's ever going to affect us. So I think those are some of the options that you're going to see the United States increasingly contemplate over the course of time. Okay. Last, as I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in Iraq, Syria, and with Iran directly. And there, of course, you've seen a lot of these Iranian-allied militia groups in Iraq, in Syria, mounting these attacks. I think we're up to almost 200 attacks on American personnel in Iraq and Syria since October 7th. And, here, first, I think so far, what we've seen is that the Biden administration's approach there, at least for the moment, does seem to be working, right? Again, important to give them credit when something that they're doing actually does seem to be working. And as you are aware, 2 weeks ago, there was an attack by an Iraqi group, Kataib Hezbollah, one of Iran's most important allies, even proxies. Kataib Hezbollah really is an Iranian proxy in Iraq. Launched an attack that killed 3 American servicemen at an American base in Jordan. The administration responded with this wave of strikes against Iranian and Iranian-backed targets in Syria and Iraq, including as targets manned by Iranian personnel themselves, Revolutionary Guards in Syria in particular, some also in Iraq, very, very deliberately. And understand that the administration behind the scenes passed messages to the Iranians saying, if this happens again, our response will be even bigger. And left unsaid exactly what the US would do under those circumstances. But, it's worth remembering, the Iranians have seen the United States use much greater military power against them. Back in the 1980s, famously, the Iranians started taking shots at our ships in the Gulf, and You know, as the expression goes, we wiped out half the Iranian Navy in one afternoon. Right? It was an operation called Operation Praying Mantis. The Iranians have not forgotten that. In addition, in January of 2020, you'll remember that the United States killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guard, an absolutely brilliant, diabolically brilliant Iranian commander, very high ranking, arguably the second most powerful man in Iran. We killed him in a drone strike, along with, everyone forgets this, with Iran's most important Iranian ally in Iraq, a man by the name of Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes, who had been the commander of Kataib Hezbollah, that same proxy group that attacked the US forces in Jordan. Right? So Iran has seen what happens when the United States gets angry. We sink half their navy, we kill their second most important figure, arguably their most important military figure, again, a man who was unique in terms of his abilities and his skills to Iran. And so, not surprisingly, what we've seen is that the Iranians have tried to rein in those different militia groups, diminish the number of attacks. In particular, we've seen a tremendous lessening of attacks against Americans in Iraq. They've continued to attack some of our forces in Syria. They seem to be of the view that Syria is kind of more open season because the American presence there is technically illegal, right? The government of Syria, which is Iran's ally, did not invite in any Americans. We are there against the will of the internationally recognized government, the Assad government. In contrast, in Iraq, our forces are there at the request of the internationally recognized government of Iraq. That seems to be how Iran is kind of splitting those hairs. But just worth thinking about, again, a couple of bigger points. One, in this case, the Biden administration's actions seem to have actually worked. And they seem to have worked because the Iranians believed that there was a threat to themselves directly, and because they had the ability to rein in their Iraqi and Syrian allies in a way that they may not have with Yemen. Right? And what this all speaks to is, again, at some level, the Iranians are behind a lot of what is going on in the Middle East. As I said, not all of it. They're not behind what's going on with the Houthis and their role in the Hamas attack. And clearly they had a role, but the extent of it is unclear. They have a much greater role with other groups, with the Iranian-backed groups in Iraq, with those in Syria, and also with Hezbollah. Right? And Hezbollah, for its own interests, has had no desire to start a bigger war with Israel, and also because Hezbollah is very important to Iran. We should always remember that for Iran, Hezbollah is their ultimate deterrent. Their feeling is that the reason that Israel has never attacked them, and if Israel ever did attack them directly, their go-to response would then be to start having Hezbollah lobbing hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of rockets and missiles into Israel, which, however many Israelis it killed, would shut down the Israeli economy, right? Would be devastating to Israel economically. And so Iran itself has no desire to lose Hezbollah in a way that it seemed perfectly willing to fight to the last Palestinian when it came to Hamas, and they're probably willing to fight till the last Houthi when it comes to Yemen. So those are some important differences. And the last piece of this is we should never forget that at the end of the day, this is simultaneously a fight against a variety of different actors in the Middle East. Right? People often liken it to an octopus. I hate that analogy, right? The Iran's axis of resistance is not an octopus. It's almost certainly not the case that if you cut off the head, if you could somehow destroy the Iranian regime, all of these other tentacles would simply wither and die. If we somehow could find a way to destroy the Iranian regime, something I would be all in favor of for a whole variety of different reasons, starting with the fact that they have simply declared themselves to be our enemy and refuse multiple offers of rapprochement with the United States. Even if we could somehow do that, we would still have huge problems with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with the Houthis, with a whole variety of these other groups. right? They are a collective. Yes, Iran is more than first among equals, but they are a collective. And as the United States thinks about handling these problems in the Middle East, which are likely to get worse before they get better, if they ever get better, we need to think about strategies that will deal with each of the problems individually as well as collectively. All right, I will stop there and I'll be glad to take whatever questions you all have for me.
Ken, let me ask the first question if I could. Could you take a minute or two to look again inside Iran in the sense that, or with the objective of, it's obvious that they feel at the moment they're in the catbird seat and are enjoying immensely what's going on with the Houthis and Gaza and so forth. But internally, one gets the feeling that the regime is not all that happy with its economy, number one, with its inability, as you just pointed out, to totally control the Houthis and their other proxies like Hezbollah and so forth. And there are just issues, for example, a specific one with that $6 billion payment that we had agreed to make to them based on the prisoner exchange issue, which came up several months ago. That's been frozen. And in general, you get the feeling that the populace is not particularly happy with the clerics anymore. Khamenei is, what, 82 or 3, and perhaps not in great health. Not that he wouldn't have a successor who is just as bad as he is, but still, putting all those things together, how do you assess what's going on internally in Iran?
Yeah, so this is a fabulous question, Tyler. And again, as an Iran expert, something I spend a lot of time thinking about. Let me see if I can give you what I will consider to be a relatively brief answer to that great question. Because you're absolutely right. Excuse me a second. Iran is one of these countries that simultaneously is very aggressive and very threatening externally, but also has very significant internal problems, right? And historically, those two things often go together, right? We often find states that become very aggressive in part as a way of addressing their internal problems. And oftentimes we find that states that are very aggressive externally create internal problems for themselves through their external aggression. So this is not an unusual pattern historically at all. In the case of Iran, I think you've described it very nicely. As far as the Iranians are concerned, they're winning across the Middle East, right? This stuff is generally going very well for them. My sense is that Hamas is probably absorbing more damage than the Iranians expected. That ultimately, I think they are concerned that Hamas will be destroyed by Israel, given Israel's determination to do so and the inability of anyone, whether it's Iran's axis of resistance or the international community, to stop Israel from doing so. And that would obviously be a setback for the Iranians, but nonetheless, probably a setback that the Iranians were willing to accept, because at the end of the day, it has created so many other opportunities for Iran, so much ill will toward Iran and toward the United States, probably worthwhile for the Iranians. But you're right, at the same token, or by the same token, the Iranians are experiencing worsening internal problems, and worsening for a variety of different ways. First, their economy is in very, very tough shape. Their greater ability to export oil, because the US is not enforcing sanctions stringently, has been helpful, but really not that much, right? We should always remember Iran is a country of 84 million people. And even 1.5 million, 2 million barrels per day of oil exports is just not enough to keep 84 million people living good lives. That's especially because Iran is one of the most corrupt societies on earth, and its government is just hideously mismanaged, right? And it all goes back to the fact that during the revolution, they brought in all of these clerics who didn't have the first bit of understanding of how to govern a country or run an economy. They brought all these people into office, put them in charge of the government and the economy. They did terrible things, made enormous mistakes, and oftentimes privileged successors who were just as ignorant and just as corrupt as they were, right? So Iran has huge fundamental problems. All of that has led to, as I think everybody listening in knows, endless public unhappiness with this government, right? Every 2 or 3 years, we see a new wave of massive nationwide protests. And, they get sparked by different things, right? The protests in 2019 were sparked by gas prices. Those in 2022, I guess it was, were sparked by the death of this young Kurdish woman, right? In every case, those are just the sparks. The problem is that there's tons of kindling lying around. And what we've consistently seen from the Iranian regime is that they simultaneously don't see their external aggression and their internal weakness as being connected. And their response to both is simply more force, right? Greater use of force, greater aggression, right? They believe in aggression abroad and repression at home. And unfortunately, they've gotten quite good at both. And in particular, since we're talking about the internal piece, they've gotten quite good at suppressing these nationwide protests whenever they break out. Lots of Iranians are badly disheartened, thinking that they will never have the opportunity to get rid of this regime, even though it's very clear that the vast majority of Iranians would very much like to do so. The one big question mark out there is exactly that piece that you ended on, which is this question of succession. Ayatollah Khamenei is actually 84. He is rumored to have had prostate cancer, although exactly what kind of shape he's in, nobody knows. It does seem likely that he will pass from the scene sooner rather than later. Although, I can remember as a Middle East expert that the Israelis were insistent that Hafez al-Assad was about to die for a good 20 years before he actually did so. So it's very hard to gauge these things. And it may be that he hangs on for a lot longer than people believe. But this question of succession is a very big one. There's no doubt that there are lots of Iranians, opposition political figures, but also just average Iranians who desperately hope that Khamenei's death will lead to widespread instability and bring down this regime altogether. And that certainly is the fear, the concern of many of the regime establishment, the hardliners who now run this regime. And let's recognize the Iranian leadership is now overwhelmingly hardliners. Yes, there are reformists in Iran. Yes, there are moderates in Iran. They have all been completely sidelined in the last few years. The government is now homogeneously hardline. From the president, Raisi, through the Revolutionary Guard to the judiciary, everywhere you look in the Iranian leadership, they are all hardliners, right? So they're not interested in a different foreign policy. This is their foreign policy of choice. And they're also not interested in a different domestic approach, politically, economically, or in terms of this emphasis on simply crushing opposition rather than reforming or negotiating with opposition. But it is always important to remember, Iran is one of the most fragmented and vociferous political systems on the planet. One of the great Persianists of the 20th century, old friend of mine, Rui Ramazani. Rui used to say that Iranian politics are like a kaleidoscope, composed of 1,000 little pieces of glass. And every time you turn the kaleidoscope, every time you change the issue, all the little pieces of glass line up differently, right? And his point there was that, Iran is endlessly fragmented. And even within this kind of relatively homogeneous group of hardliners, there are still enormous, endless difficulties and enormous, endless divisions among them. And as a result, succession to Khamenei may be a fraught process. It may be very, very difficult, right? All these factions will agree that the successor to Khamenei has to be a hardliner. And then they're likely to fight endlessly over who that hardliner will be, right? Outside of Iran, this is, again, it's one of these parlor games. We take bets, we throw out names of people who might succeed Khamenei. Lord only knows if we're right about these, right? But there are obvious figures like the current president, Ibrahim Raisi, who for a while there, it looked like Khamenei was actually grooming to be his successor. Maybe he will be the successor. But, he also seemed to be kind of favoring his own son, Mustafa, right? Maybe Mustafa will be his successor. Maybe it'll be a Revolutionary Guard general. Maybe it'll be somebody we've never heard of before. We don't know. But the more important point is that Khamenei's death might spark infighting among these different groups. Now, again, we don't know. It may also be that they've pre-cooked all of this, right? That they've worked it all out, that they've got the name, that they've come up with some kind of a compromise candidate. We do not know. But it could also be that his death will lead to splits within the hardline faction that will suddenly open up new opportunities, right? And will allow some of these groups that are currently on the outs to suddenly have influence, to suddenly be able to do things. That is a bit of hope. And given that the Middle East often seems like a land without hope, it's nice to have a little bit of optimism to latch onto.
Well, Ken, that was one heck of a comprehensive response to what I thought was a fairly simple question. I guess it wasn't. So I'm sure we have more questions from the panel. I hope.
Oh, Tyler, I could ask a question.
Yeah.
Thanks for all that, Ken. One of the countries most impacted by the troubles in the Red Sea is Egypt with the Suez Canal. Are they trying to take any action to open this waterway?
Great question, Peter. So the answer I give is yes and no. You're right that Egypt is badly hurt by the closure of maritime traffic through the Red Sea, right? Is really hitting their bottom line. They hate that, and they are trying very, very hard to do something about it diplomatically. And that's the critical point, is they're not doing anything militarily. And they're not doing anything militarily for two reasons. First, Egypt's military capabilities are extremely limited. And there was a period of time where the Egyptians were kind of okay, right? In 1973, during the October War, the Yom Kippur War, they poured everything they had into that fight. And they eked out a very modest victory in the first 4 days, only to have the Israelis unravel that in the next 16, 17 days afterwards. So that was the height of modern Egyptian military fortunes, and they've kind of declined ever since then. But in some ways, even more important than that is the kind of political military dimension, which is that the Egyptians, despite their 4-decade-old peace treaty with the Israelis, it's never been a warm peace. Most Egyptians don't like Israel. Most Egyptians, cheer on the Palestinians in even their most, obscene forms, such as Hamas. And therefore, it's politically very, very dangerous for any Egyptian government to use force in support of some action that is seen as pro-Israel, or to use force against some group that is seen as against Israel. And as I said, the Houthis have done a wonderful job tying their military actions to the Palestinian cause, which makes it politically almost impossible for the Egyptians to oppose them militarily, right? Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, is many things, but doesn't seem to be terribly politically courageous. The lesson that he took, it seems, from the assassination of Anwar Sadat in 1981 is, if you do anything that looks like you're helping Israel, you're likely to get killed. And that's not a risk he seems willing to run.
Thank you.
Ken,
I asked you before, if you were in charge and had ultimate power, what would be your take on how to resolve the Israel-Hamas war? I'm giving you
Naomi,
full power here, you know.
Naomi, and I thought you were my friend.
Wait, I
Uh,
have another question too.
even worse. So yeah, I can't think of jobs I'd like to have less than being Prime Minister of Israel. President of the United States would also be in that same category. Look, what I'll say in answer to that is that first, I absolutely understand the rage that Israelis are feeling, the terror that they are feeling, right? It's very much like, for those on the call old enough to remember it, very much like the way that we felt after 9/11. I absolutely get it. And in some ways, it's even worse. As a kind of percentage of population, what the Israelis suffered on 9/11, on 10/7 was far worse than what we suffered on 9/11. Plus, you had the deliberate slaughter of children, the deliberate rape of women, right? These are all things that the US didn't suffer on 9/11. So I absolutely understand that. I absolutely understand that the Israelis are not going to accept any end state in Gaza that is going to allow for a new threat to them. All right, you knew there was a but coming, so here's the but. The but is that perpetual Israeli occupation of Gaza, I just don't think is going to work either. The Israelis tried that.
It wouldn't work.
Exactly. That's why. And we should remember it was Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon, not exactly known as an old softy, right? Not exactly known as a great liberal, right? Ariel Sharon, the hardest of the hardliners, he was the one who withdrew from Gaza. And he did it not as some gift to the Palestinians. He did it because it was an open sore for Israel. It was something that the Israeli polity simply couldn't bear forever. And Sharon got that. And I think that Sharon's lesson, his understanding, continues to operate to this day. And so I do think that we have to think about, first and foremost, some kind of an international force coming in there to handle security in Gaza, because I don't think that leaving the IDF there is going to work over the long term. It is going to lead to just repeated conflict. But we also need to recognize, and this is the part that's going to be really hard for Americans to swallow, we need to recognize that the Israelis are not going to accept any military force in Gaza that does not include significant numbers of American combat troops. They're just not going to trust anyone else. They will trust their own troops. They might trust us. There is literally no one else on the planet that they're going to trust. And so I think we're going to need to think about that very hard, right? And think about it not like Iraq, not like Afghanistan, but like Bosnia and Kosovo, right? Both places where the United States did deploy tens of thousands of American combat troops that were critical as part of a multinational peacekeeping force that actually did keep the peace and end those conflicts. But the other piece of it is that I do think that Israel has to recognize that there is going to have to be a Palestinian state of some kind, that the two-state solution is the only alternative, not because it's a good alternative, but simply because, as Winston Churchill famously said about democracy, it's better than, or it is, sorry, it's the worst form of, Churchill's line about democracy, right, was it's the worst form of government on the planet except for every other government that's ever been tried, right? So too for a two-state solution, right? This is a point that Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer once made famously, and other people are now repeating that, again, the reason he continues to believe, or continued to believe, in the two-state solution for Israel and Palestinians was simply that every other alternative was even worse. And I think that if we take a different approach, we take the approach to Gaza that we should have taken in Iraq, but that the Bush administration threw out the window, a much longer term process of building democracy, building new leadership from the ground up, not importing Palestinian leaders from the West Bank or somewhere else, right? That there is the potential for making that work. But as I said, right now, it all sounds impossible. And my guess is that 90% of you who are listening to me right now are thinking that everything I just said was absolutely impossible, right? Right now it is. All I'm saying is it's probably the only solution that will work for Israel and, for that matter, for the Palestinians and for every other country. And so my hope is that at some point we will get past its impossibility and figure out how to make it possible.
Different question. In Iran, do we know of any underground movement that can be tapped into to build further resistance to the regime?
Oh, you betcha.
Oh,
To folks in
I
Minnesota.
like that answer.
There are lots of very unhappy people in Iran, and certainly someone, I don't know who, but certainly someone has been aiding those groups. So very quickly, there are the Pollack out in the far east of Iran. They are an ethnic group that spans the Iranian-Pakistani border a little bit into Afghanistan as well. They have been a massive thorn in Iran's side for decades. And someone has been arming, helping, encouraging them. There are the Arabs down in southwestern Iran who also don't like the Persian-dominated government. They too have been mounting protests and terrorist attacks and sabotage attacks against the Iranian regime in recent years. They too seem to be getting help from someone, I'm not sure who. And finally, up in the far northwest of Iran are the Kurds. The Kurds, and this was everyone likes to fault the cartographic skills of Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot, the Englishman and Frenchman who drew many of the boundaries in that part of the world. I will tell you that those lines are actually much better than most people give them credit for. But the one great disservice they did was carving up the Kurds, right? And so the Kurds, they're Kurdish populations in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, and Turkey, and they are unhappy everywhere. And the Kurds too have been fighting against the Iranian regime for most of the last century, and they too have been amping up their attacks on the Iranian regime, their resistance to the Iranian regime over the last few years. And again, they're getting help from somewhere, I'm not sure who.
Thank you, Ken.
So
If I
some
could ask another
questions.
question,
Wait, can we get some questions in from the audience, Peter?
go ahead.
Okay, so I guess one question was, who is funding the Houthis? And
Sure.
also, what are Saudi Arabia and the UAE currently doing about them?
Okay, so first, the Houthis don't get a whole lot of funding. As it, Yemen is desperately poor. They control the north of Yemen. So to the extent that there are revenues, to the extent that there's economic activity in the north, the Houthis control that economic activity. They don't control much of Yemen's oil production, even though Yemen has very little. But in a country as desperately poor as Yemen, even that little bit of oil revenue is useful, but that's mostly beyond Houthi control. And then at the end of the day, they do get some degree of support from the Iranians. Hard to say how much. Mostly what they get from the Iranians is weaponry, but that's mostly what the Houthis want and need. As I said, Yemen is a desperately poor country. It is a desperately backwards country. And so even the small amounts of military assistance that the Houthis get from Iran go a long way in terms of their ability to wage the Yemeni civil war. And now, as we're seeing, their ability to mount these attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. As for the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they feel badly burned by their experience in Yemen, right? And right now they're experiencing a tremendous amount of schadenfreude. Back in 2014, 2015, the Saudis and the Emiratis were saying to the United States and anyone who would listen, the Houthis are bad guys. You don't understand how much trouble they are. You need to join us in preventing the Houthis from taking control of Yemen. And of course, they went in, the Obama administration gave them the most half-hearted support imaginable, mostly because we needed their help in the fight against ISIS elsewhere in the Middle East. Right? And after that, of course, the United States mostly brought tremendous pressure on the Saudis and the Emiratis to get out of Yemen. And in fact, we short-circuited a very successful Emirati-led ground campaign against the Houthis, which was doing tremendous damage to the Houthis and was about to take away their last major port, the port of Hodeidah, which would have been just a phenomenal setback for the Houthis. And we pull the plug on the Emirati and Saudi operation. We forced both of them more or less to pull out. The Saudis continue to provide some air support, and the Emiratis continue to provide a little bit of assistance, both to the internationally recognized government of Yemen, but mostly they're sitting it out. And what's more worth remembering, the Saudis and on their own, the Emiratis negotiated a deal with the Iranians, right? This was this deal about a year ago that they struck, that the Chinese brokered, and everybody was up in arms, that the Saudis were making a deal with Iran and the Chinese were brokering it, right? The deal was that the Iranians would get the Houthis to stop mounting these drone and ballistic missile attacks on the Saudi capital of Riyadh, which had been going on for years. And the Saudis wanted them stopped. And in return, the Iranians agreed to get the Houthis to stop them. And that stuck, right? And so the Houthis have not been attacking the Saudi capital of Riyadh or the Emirati capital of Abu Dhabi. And the Saudis and Emiratis, again, they're sitting on the sidelines. Their feeling is, we tried, you Americans stopped us, you prevented us from doing so. So we did what we had to do. We cut a deal with the Iranians to turn off these Houthi ballistic missile attacks. We see no reason to start that up again and risk restarting those ballistic missile attacks when all you Americans are doing is screwing around in the Red Sea.
And can we focus back on Saudi Arabia for a second? As you know, just prior to October 7th, the Saudis and the Israelis were getting very close, I think, to having creating a rapprochement or an establishment of relationships that went well beyond what they had ever had prior. Now, obviously, that got badly derailed by October 7th. Do you sense that the will and the interest in reestablishing that tie is still extant and will happen eventually?
Absolutely. Right. So what's been interesting is, the Emiratis, who did normalize relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords, they've made clear they are not cutting those ties, right, as a result of October 7th or the subsequent Israeli counteroffensive in Gaza. The Saudis, too, have kind of put the talks on ice, but they've made very clear that they're not off the table. And privately, they're telling anybody who will listen that, yeah, eventually they want to get back to them. For them, these talks are part of a strategic necessity for Saudi Arabia. They need an alliance with Israel. They need Israeli technology. They need Israeli business know-how. But most important of all, they need Israel's military capabilities in a wider alliance against Iran. What they have right now with Iran is at best a truce. They do not believe that the Iranians have given up their intentions, their malign intentions towards Saudi Arabia, and they see the Iranians continuing to act aggressively across the Middle East in their bid to dominate the Middle East, to reestablish, in effect, a new version of the Persian Empire. That doesn't accord with Saudi interests at all. So they do want to get there eventually. The problem that they have, of course, is that while the Saudi government has no use for the Palestinians, and they may not like the Israelis, but they see the Israelis as being very useful to them. The Saudi populace doesn't see things that way at all, right? The Saudi populace has tremendous cultural affinity with the Palestinians and tend to still be very, very anti-Semitic. And so this is what the Saudi government is trying to negotiate, is this big gap between their strategic interests and their people's emotional beliefs.
Now, just quickly, a Saudi-Israeli deal would be contingent, from what I gather, on a U.S. security guarantee. I mean, that's the talk, isn't it?
Yeah, it would have to be something. I highly doubt that the Saudis would get what they're asking for, which is a treaty with the United States. I mean, My God, you can't get anything through the US Congress these days, right? We couldn't get a border bill through the US Congress. So how the heck are we going to get a treaty with Saudi Arabia? But yeah, I think that you will get some new American commitment to the defense of Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, would be really good for Israel, Saudi Arabia, for the whole region, right? We don't want a Saudi-Israeli alliance without an American component to it. That could actually be very dangerous for the region because both our Saudi and Israeli allies lack our intelligence capabilities, much more fearful, much more likely to go off half-cocked than if we're part of that mix.
So, if I can ask some questions then, there's a number of questions that are talking about what do we believe or do you believe to be the ultimate gain or the goal of the Israelis in Gaza? Um, so is it to drive them into Egypt and not let them back and take over the land? Um, what exactly do you feel is sort of their goal other than what we're hearing right now, which is just, that they want to, clear out the South?
Right. Well, first, I mean, you do have the problem of, the old joke, right? I'll tell it this way. Ask two Israelis a question and you'll get 7 different opinions, right? So, that's the starting point, is every Israeli has his or her own version of what they believe the right answer is for Gaza. They're absolutely certain it is the right answer for Gaza, and they believe that they're just as entitled to it as the prime minister or minister of defense or anyone else. So that's all going to need to be hashed out. And certainly there are members of the Netanyahu cabinet, which we should always remember is the most extreme that we have ever seen, right? With people who believe all kinds of absolutely outrageous things about what should happen with the Palestinian population. And they do talk about, driving the Palestinians out of Gaza altogether. That seems very unlikely. That does not seem to be where most Israeli opinion or even the opinion of most of the Israeli government is right now. Instead, what they talk about is the importance of destroying Hamas, that is, eliminating Hamas as a military entity capable of threatening Israel and as a political entity that will govern, can govern Gaza. Now, that's really what most of them are focused on. That in and of itself is going to be a tall order, but not impossible, right? The real issue there, goes back to a point that I made earlier, both in my opening remarks and in response to Naomi's earlier question, which is that so much that really does depend on the day after in Gaza, right? In post-war reconstruction in Gaza. Because what history has taught over and over and over again is that it's not enough to simply kill a lot of people or even destroy the infrastructure of a group like Hamas. The way that you permanently eliminate it is by creating a better alternative so that people don't feel like they have no alternative but to go back to Hamas. They can actually cast their lot with a different group of people who offer a different, better future for them. And therefore, they can attach themselves to that, support it, put their shoulder behind it, right? Time and again, what we've seen works in these kinds of situations. You want to eliminate a noxious group like Hamas, you've got to build something better for them, which again, to me, is why the two-state solution remains the only alternative. Because you've got to say to over 1 million Palestinians, this is a better pathway for you. Right? This is a different life that you could have that will be better for you. Attach yourselves to this, invest not just your hopes and your dreams, but your blood, sweat, and tears, your effort invested in them, not Hamas. That will take you to a different route. That's the way that you ultimately root out a group like Hamas.
So there are a number of questions about sort of ethnic cleansing, including the settlers that are in Israel. And so I guess the question is just a response to that. I guess also the question on Gaza, would Israel play a part in assuming that there was a two-state or a movement toward that, would they be also part of the reconstruction process and donate funds and expertise?
Let me handle the second part first. Yes, Israel should be, right? There's no question about that. Everyone should contribute, and it would be great if the Israelis could do so. Again, it would be building a better future for themselves if it were actually to work. And I just forgot having a senior moment. The first part of the question again, June?
It's about ethnic cleansing.
Right, ethnic cleansing. Thank you. Right. So this is the harder part of it. And for a moment, I want to be historically accurate, but kind of brutally frank, which is ethnic cleansing can work, right? Historically speaking, ethnic cleansing can absolutely work. There are plenty of peoples around the world who were eliminated, uprooted, moved, right? Even just within recent memory. It's worth always remembering that at the end of the Second World War, all kinds of borders were redrawn, right? And people moved. Millions of Germans were thrown out of Silesia and West Prussia and Pomerania, right, and forced to move westward, right? Millions of Poles were forced out of Eastern Poland and forced to move westward, right? We have seen this over and over and over again throughout history. Sometimes it works, right? Populations, and I'm using the aftermath of the Second World War very, very deliberately. Sometimes populations reconcile themselves to it. Yeah, West Prussia used to be part of Germany, and we lived there and we loved it, but now it's not. And now we live somewhere else, and West Prussia is now part of Poland, right? And it's now Western Poland, not West Prussia. And again, sometimes people reconcile themselves and you never hear about it ever again. There aren't too many Germans who are demanding West Prussia back from Poland. There are other instances where people are not reconciled to it, where it becomes an irredentist issue that they will carry for generations. Alsace-Lorraine, right? For decades, centuries, the French and the Germans fought over Alsace-Lorraine, each side believing that it innately, naturally belonged to them and had been taken away from them. And while I wouldn't say that, the wars in 1870 or 1914 or 1939 were caused by Alsace-Lorraine, there's also no question that that was part of the cause of war. Whether you could have ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and Gaza and have it work out well, badly, is anyone's guess, right? Based on the history, based on the history that we've seen since 1948, I would suggest that it would be a bad bet to assume that the Palestinians and the wider Arab population will simply accept it and learn to move on. There are any number of Palestinians who seem incapable of doing so, uninterested in doing so, and there are plenty of Arabs who, whether it be for emotional reasons or reasons of pure Machiavellian strategic calculus, don't want to let it go. I suspect that it's more likely that you would have that bad kind of an outcome if the Israelis were to pursue further ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and in Gaza. And that is, again, why I think that a two-state solution is the better, or at least the least bad option.
Thank you.
Well, Ken, it looks like you're going over. You've been talking for about an hour and 20 minutes, which is more than phenomenal. You have reminded us brilliantly how complex and possibly unresolvable a lot of these problems are in the Middle East. We most appreciate your contributing to us, and I think we've all benefited. And to those questioners who didn't get their questions answered, we've got to realize that Ken probably has had 20 phone calls during our session since 10 o'clock. So I do think it's only fair to let him go. So Ken, thank you very much. And we hope to see you in a future session. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ken, very much.
My
I also
pleasure.
remind everyone that Monday, March 11th at 10 a.m., we will be Here again, we'll be talking about Africa with Ambassador Tibor Naji, who has served as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs from 2018 to 21. He'll be speaking on the scramble of that for Africa and why the U.S. is losing. And so I think this is another aspect of sort of the multipolar scrambling for power, resources, that we see that there is also an effort to sort of carve up for resources that the superpowers are also involved with. So he will be talking about that. So join us then. Ken, again, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Good. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming, and thank the planning committee. And a special thank you to Ken. Bye, everyone.